absolute and relative macros. When we're recording a macro, we have a choice between a relative referencing macro or an absolute referencing macro. In the Developer tab, just below the words Record Macro, you'll see an option called Use Relative Referencing. When that button is clicked, it turns on relative referencing, and when it's turned off, it means that it's using absolute referencing. Absolute reference macro means that it records the exact cells that you click on, and if the macro is replayed, no matter what cell you click on before running the macro, it would return to the initial selected cells used when recording the macro. So, for example, if I start to record a macro without the relative referencing turned on, so I click Record Macro, and I'm going to call this one Absolute. So this is going to be an example of an absolute macro, and I press OK. I'm going to click inside of A1 and I'm going to type the word Jan for January, and I'm going to drag it across as far as F1. I'm then going to finish by clicking in A2, and then I'm going to stop recording. Every time I run that macro, it will fill in January through to June in the cells A1 to F1, and will always finish the macro on A2. So for example, if I just delete this data here for a moment, and I'm going to run the macro, so I go to Macros, Absolute and Run, you can see that even though I started elsewhere on the page, it returned to A1, typed Jan, dragged it across as far as F1 and returned to F2. So let me just show you that again. If I start over here in K3 and then I run the macro, you'll see it returns me to the cells each time, and this is because it's an absolute macro. Let me record the exact same macro, but this time using relative referencing. So this time I'm going to click Relative References and then Record Macro. For this macro, I'm going to call it Relative, and I'm going to press the OK button. I'm going to type the word Jan. I'm going to drag it across as far as F1 for June, and then I'm going to click underneath, and then I'm going to stop recording. The only difference between these two macros was the fact that I had relative referencing turned on. So I'm going to delete the information, I'm going to click over into a completely separate cell, and I'm going to run the relative macro this time. So I go to Macros, click on Relative and press Run. And we can see the difference here is it doesn't return me to the exact cells. It takes the cell that I'm starting on and it then continues the macro relative to that cell. So when I use relative referencing in a macro, the macro is recorded with actions relative to the initial selected cell. Have a look at recording two separate macros, one with the relative referencing turned on and one as an absolute reference with the relative referencing turned off, and see the difference between the two.